that's an incorrect comparison.
Mm-hmm.
I know they want to do that. I'm not the towering personality MacArthur was, and there was none of the kinds of friction between me and President Obama that there was between General MacArthur and President Truman. So that comparison's apples and oranges. People want to make it. Here's what I do draw out of it, though. On a very tactical level, what happened was people were not doing much to support the war effort in terms of information. So I felt like in Afghanistan, we had to do things on the information warfare side, do a lot of press that I would rather not have done. But it wasn't being done in D.C. in support of it. They were trying to keep arm's length. So we were trying to build confidence on the part of people. So I was doing more press than I thought. The story that came out in the Rolling Stone was completely unexpected. It was supposed to be sort of a puff piece on the command team. We got that wrong. We didn't vet the guy. I don't think his portrayal was accurate or fair. But separate from that, even if it is or isn't, what happened was this very negative report comes out that alleges that we are at least dismissive of senior leadership. And that blows up, and that causes an embarrassment for the president. And it's my job not to cause an embarrassment for the president. So I didn't think we'd done anything, but it's my job to take responsibility. So I had no hesitation doing that. My final meeting with President Obama was civil, as all my interactions had been before and since, because we put a problem on his plate that he shouldn't have been stuck with. So he was a bit boxed there in that particular instance. So sort of separate that. But more broadly, the civil military part wasn't as comfortable as it should have been. I don't think the interaction was deep enough and often enough. I asked a number of times to have a one-on-one with President Obama so I could lay out my strategy, not so that he would necessarily think the strategy was perfect, although it's his strategy, but he has to understand if he's comfortable with me. He has to understand if the person representing him there. And there was a lot of reasons that didn't happen, but I disagreed with him. I thought that should have been forced to make happen. This was still a relatively new administration. And to be honest, when you try to deal with it, you think you're dealing with this unified group. They're not. They were a bunch of personalities all jousting for position in the White House. And so you'd get different answers, different perspectives. You could see things going on, which that makes it natural, but it makes it much more difficult. Plus, I'm trying to do it from thousands of miles away. I'm doing it largely by video teleconference. So I think what we need to step back and say is, if we think that a team that's going to prosecute a war, which starts with the president and includes the vice president, secretary of defense, secretary of state, the key players, if they've got to make a series of tough decisions and actions, they need to be a team. Companies spend a lot to build teams. Sports teams spend millions of dollars, not just training the skills of the players, but bringing team cohesion. The U.S. government does nothing. We take a bunch of big personalities, big egos, throw them into an incredibly difficult situation, and we expect this thing to work like a Swiss watch. And that's not my experience. And so we ought to relook that. We ought to be respectful of the difficulty and complexity of the tasks like this, and we ought to figure out ways to help the government become more effective at doing it.
In the aftermath of the Rolling Stone article that came out, how did you process the military's relationship with the press and with the media? How important is it, do you think, for the military to be transparent with the press, and how should that relationship work?
Yeah, it is naturally going to be in tension, just like the press's relationship with government. That is their job. They have to be in tension. I remember in the spring of 2003 with the initial invasion of Iraq, I was in the Pentagon at the time, and we did that embedding, and reporters went with the American forces for the invasion of Iraq. And they quickly became absolutely co-opted by the U.S. military. When you ride in the back of an armored vehicle with a bunch of privates, you fall in love with them. And so they literally lost their ability to be unbiased observers. And they kind of knew that. After the fact, At first, they sort of celebrated it. And then after the fact, they said, wow, we went too far. There has to be attention. They have to be the people always looking under the rocks. And so you're not going to be buddies with them, and you shouldn't try to be. My experience really goes back to the tail end of Vietnam, when the American military came out of Vietnam with this great mistrust of the press. Almost this idea that the press was the reason we didn't win. Now, that's not the reason we didn't win, but there's a certain percentage of the military that drew that conclusion. And most of the military drew the first conclusion was stay away from the press. Literally just stay as far away as you can, say nothing. And then they realized that wouldn't work. And then we went through an era where we said, we'll manage the press. We'll get really good at managing them. We'll teach people press skills. We'll bring the press in. We'll make them our friends. And we'll get the coverage we want. And that's not true either. We went through that sort of in the 90s. That's not realistic either. I think that interestingly enough, the best view of the press came out of a quote from Dave Petraeus one day. We were in a meeting in Baghdad, and one of his staff officers came in and was complaining. He said that the press is not fair to us. You know, we opened a kindergarten this week in Baghdad for young Iraqi kids, and the press won't cover it. All they want to cover is the 14 car bombs. And Petraeus just stopped him. He said, hey, as long as 14 car bombs are going off, that is the story. What we have to do is change that reality and then hope that they cover things honestly and accurately going forward. And that was at that point, Dave was pretty seasoned interlocutor with the press. So I think that what I drew from the Rolling Stone is the first thing, I would not say stay away from the press. Don't extrapolate what that writer did as being indicative of what every writer is going to do. However, always go into every press interaction in a mature, realistic way, understanding what their role is, understanding what you're trying to do. And transparency is usually better than not. You know, I'm not saying you got to tell everybody everything all the time, but I'm saying that I told a lot of people, don't draw the conclusion from what happened to me that we shouldn't interact with the press. Draw the conclusion as we could have done that interaction better.
Mm-hmm. On that note about the press, recently you've gained some attention for your criticism of President Trump and his response to you. There's been a lot of debate in the civil community about the role of retired officers in politics.
Yeah.
Some scholars, like retired Admiral Mike Mullen, say that they should be extremely careful about what they say because speaking out can politicize the military. And others simply argue that retired officers are now civilians and they're free to exercise their First Amendment right as they see fit. Where do you place yourself on that spectrum?
Yeah, much closer to Mike Mullen. I think that retired officers have to be very, very careful about it. And we do because everything we do casts a shadow on the active force. So if a retired officer gets out and goes very political, people in government look at all the active duty and they start to wonder, what's that person's political leanings? What do they think? Where are they going? And then you can start to have either a view of the officer corps as politicized, or even worse, the officer corps starts to become politicized. And that would be just a huge problem for the nation. So I'm much closer to where Mike Mullen is. I was very disturbed by the 2016 election campaign, where people got political and whatnot. I spoke out about President Trump this time after a lot of soul searching on it. And as you notice, I didn't speak about his policies. I didn't speak about his politics. What I concluded, and as I say, I spent a long time agonizing over this, was we had crossed a line. The president had started not only attacking people like Jim Mattis and others, and it's okay to criticize certain people, and I thought that had gone way out of line. And then when he visited troops in Iraq, and he basically broke faith with young troops because young troops don't know better. And if a politician or leader goes out and gives heavily politicized things, he's breaking not just the norm, but he's violating the trust that people have in that relationship. It's almost like the sexual predator thing of superior subordinate. And I was hugely bothered by his actions there. So my problem with President Trump are around the basic values that he brings to the job. I mean, his personal values and the rest of his life are his personal issue. I mean, there's personal business. How they affect the job as commander-in-chief in the presidency do matter. They matter a lot. I see it with allies and whatnot. And my worry is my silence, I was afraid was going to be characterized as agreement with what he's doing. And I don't agree with that part of it. Again, I separate it from the policies or politics. But I think we have crossed a line. This is abnormal times to me. And at that point, I think retired officers are in a different role, or my comments, I put them in a different role. That may be me rationalizing, but I feel pretty strongly about that.
On that issue of kind of how your silence would or wouldn't be characterized, I guess a lot of people worry that speaking out can also just be characterized as a partisan attack because we live in such a hyper-politicized environment. People in the general public reading this story, whatever, on ABC News, aren't going to allow for that much nuance in the explanation. They're just going to see General McChrystal speaks out. He's against the president.
Yeah, I mean, that's the danger of this. We're not in a nuanced environment. Most people aren't listening to podcasts. They're getting really short snippets from one side or the other. And so there's a great danger there. At the same time, you got to look yourself in the mirror. We have hit a certain point, and you got to look yourself in the mirror. And I'm not drawing an analogy between Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler or between Saddam Hussein and Donald Trump. But I am asking, when militaries start to go along, and it's fine to be loyal to the government. It's even fine to be loyal, and you should be loyal to the leadership of that. But when that causes you to cross lines, moral lines, values, ethics, and whatnot, we're in a different place. And you can find yourself crossing those lines bit by bit, not with one sudden long jump. And I think we need to remind ourselves what our values are.
One final question for you, sir, before you go. Many of our classmates here at the Harris School of Public Policy will go into careers that aren't directly related to national security. What do you want them to know about the military?
Yeah, a lot more than they do, because we have separated the military and whatnot. And the military's actually enjoyed that to a degree. And I'm not saying on purpose, because people don't understand this. And so they hold the military in this exalted reverence. And they think that we're all, incredible warriors and also brave and selfless and all this kind of stuff. And that's part of that's true and part of that isn't true. We're another big organization that's got bureaucracy. We've got human beings that are good, that are bad. We've got all of that stuff. And I want them to understand that, because the military should be a reflection of society. The good, the bad of society, not separate from society, not better than society. And so it's really important that they understand that they feel not in awe of the military. They feel like owners of the military. They feel like stockholders of the military, and they're interested. Sometimes they should give hard scrutiny to us. They should call us on things. And I think that's what I want civilians to do, not just automatically thank us for our service and assume that we got it all right.
You've written before a little bit about the idea of national service, the service year program. How to what extent do you think that policy solution could kind of solve some of these problems?
I think it would be the single biggest thing we could do to start to change culturally that issue. Not just the military. It would help with the civil military divide, but it would help with the divisions in our society, because if everybody had to go out and pick up trash or work with young people or work with old people or do anything for a year of their life, and they had to do it with people not from their zip code, you have a different attitude toward things you've had to invest in. And I think it would change the way we think fundamentally. It also would do a lot of other second, third order things. People vote at 3 times the rate if they've done national service. You'd keep a lot of people